how would you describe the average Chinese perception of the Uyghurs, and vice versa, the average Uyghur perception of the Chinese population?
The average perception, yes, it needs a kind of big survey, and unfortunately, we have neither you nor I have this capacity to do the survey. But from my experience and my observation as well, I would say that average China's perception of Uyghurs is quite negative, or getting more negative over time. Previously, as I indicated in the article, that previously we didn't know each other quite well because we didn't live together, and even we live it together somehow, but our relationship was just like ordinary encounters. But when we were invaded, then the whole there was a paradigm change, that it's like invaders and the invaded. So then this relationship had kind of power structure, colonial connotations, as well as unfair treatments of Uyghurs by a Han Chinese. So we see Chinese from below because we were invaded by Chinese, and that in that sense, and Chinese see us from above as invaders. And as you quite briefly mentioned, that Chinese people usually have a kind of xenophobic, even racist attitude towards other people, because as I indicated in the article, that there is a Middle Kingdom notion as a central perception, which still operative in Chinese mentality, that China, though isolated, though different, lies at the center of human civilization, and everybody else outside of civilization as barbarians. And it's not this view is nothing new, because Romans say the same thing, Greeks say the same thing about some people, the others, the aliens. And so we were the racial other to Chinese, that we were to some extent, from racial point of view, we are not fully yellow race like Chinese, but at the same time we have some features of having the same, like being belonging to the same race with Chinese. So that's also a little bit like a confusion to us as well as to them. But it's more about, not about the racial thing like black and white people in American context or others, but in this context, it's more about the ethnic difference. Like we speak this different language, we worship the different God, and we have completely different culture, etc. So that difference gives Chinese people a kind of uneasiness, because Chinese people ordinarily think that they are the best. Their culture must be emulated. Their culture must be accepted by Uyghurs. But Uyghurs have persistently resisted against this Chinese culture that has caused lots of confusion among Chinese, that why these people who are weak have been rejecting of our culture, etc. So in that sense, Chinese are irritated, even indignified by the continual refusal of Uyghurs to be Chinese. And that has created hatred. Apart from that, Chinese culture, even Chinese people, like Chinese race, let me say that, is a result of great amalgamation of lots of small like ethnic peoples or others. It's great amalgamation. So hence, they even, like for example, northern Chinese people can't understand the language of the South Cantonese, for example. The people use Putonghua don't understand the people use Cantonese, though they live under the same umbrella, but they have lots of differences. But still, they call themselves as Chinese. In that sense, that is, this kind of historical experience has given Chinese people a kind of advantage, or kind of like an entitlement, that everybody must be part of us. But then they have met with only two people have persistently resist against this. One is the Uyghurs, the other one is Tibetans. And hence this resistance has created a anxiety, frustration, confusion, and also even hatred of Chinese against Uyghurs. That's, I guess, is ordinary. And also after the 9/11 tragedy in the US, due to the global Islamophobia, and Chinese people have, due to the government propaganda, have advanced to have felt the import, like they have normalized the Uyghur phobia, because they are Muslims, they are bad people, they are threat, they are terrorists, and hence the Uyghurs are terrorists and also enemy from within are the interchangeable concept for Chinese people ordinary, and that has fueled the deepened sense of hatred of ordinary Han Chinese against Uyghurs. And for Uyghur perception of Han Chinese is that it's more like a moral, that in the sense that Uyghurs are not like, they are also see Chinese as invaders, though not all Uyghurs, but most Uyghurs see them as invaders. But most Uyghurs see Chinese as morally inferior people because of their moral behavior, moral conception, etc. Because if you look at China's history, from Uyghur mentality, the China history is full of lies, deception, and violence. Despite the fact that Chinese people portray themselves as peace-loving people, but when we learned their history, we were shocked to discover that how horrific their history was or is. And hence, Uyghurs had a kind of like a mistrust of Han Chinese, and also feel that they are morally like depraved or morally despicable people. And hence, for example, not all colonized people have a moral hatred against the colonizers, for example, in history. Some of them, yes, have, but some of them, but for Uyghurs, Han Chinese in general haven't created any kind of sense of like awe, moral respect, or moral acceptance that yes, they are great people. No. And hence, Uyghurs have developed a kind of certain sense of moral distance from Chinese. And on top of that, Islam has been a spiritual shield of Uyghurs against Chinese. For example, Uyghurs, like previously, Uyghurs usually didn't go to a Chinese family for anything to eat, for example, either dinner or lunch, whatever, because Uyghurs feel that since Chinese people use a pork, so pork is not halal or allowed for Uyghurs. So there is no like a shared meal between Uyghurs and Han Chinese. And that's a great barrier. And on top of that, interracial or interethnic marriage between two peoples was never encouraged. Though Chinese tried to get married to Uyghur girls, usually, mostly, but Uyghurs persistently resisted against this. And it's extremely unique phenomenon that despite the colonial history, there was few interethnic marriages between the two peoples. There are this world was segregated world. Uyghurs live it in their world and Chinese live it in their world. But in political world, this world is amalgamated, put under the rule of Chinese. But in cultural world, in cultural sense, this world is divided. There's no deep communication between the two peoples. Only like dialogue or communication happens in political space, but not in cultural space. No, let alone in a religious space. So hence, and ultimately this segregation or this separation, cultural separation and linguistic separation frustrated Chinese rulers, because that separation allowed Uyghurs to maintain their culture as much as possible in the process of assimilations policies. But then ultimately, after the 9/11, Chinese government was emboldened to use more like harsher and harsher assimilations and even suppressional policies against Uyghurs until they carried out a full-fledged genocide. So in 2016 or 2017.
I see.